All right. So we are thrilled to have Nikki Dukes and Latoya Smalls Norris from Coastal and CSRA respectively, and they are going to give us a tour through documentation. Okay. So the short and sweet of all this is if it didn't document it, it didn't occur. Um, Documentation is the formal record of your work, um, and this is the narrative that describes what you did, why you did it, how you did it, all those kinds of things. It adds credibility to your decisions on both interventions that you've recommended on behalf of the consumer. There are basically two functions of good documentation. One is any person picking up your case, whether it's your supervisor, a judge at the court, or the client, if they do a open records request, will understand exactly what happened and can pick up the work. Okay, and the second is it helps avoid liability and is instrumental in promoting quality assurance practices. So if you take nothing out of what I've told you today, if it isn't documented, it didn't occur.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about ingredients of a good case note. So when developing a case note, each case note must include the following information at a minimum. It must include the date, which is the month, day, and year. This helps the next person who's reading your case note identify when the visit took place. It also should include the case manager's name, so we'll know who's the case manager involved with the client's care. It also should include the type of activity that's occurring, whether it be a face-to-face, telephone call, email, or etc. You also want to document who was contacted or involved, who was present during the call/visit. Also ensuring that you have consent to speak to other individuals that are present during the visit. That should be documented in your note. You also want to document the purpose of the contact. What happened that made them case management appropriate? Why were they referred to case management to begin with? You also want to address any threats to personal health and safety. I would also address the client's preferences here as well to keep it person-centered. And again, remembering that case management isn't a one-size-fits-all. What works for one may not work for the other. So by addressing their values or preferences, it helps you develop a strong service plan and helps identify appropriate referrals. You also want to talk about what you observed during the visit, significant observation or information from the contact. It is important as a case manager to document what you see. Documenting your observations helps paint a solid picture for the next person reading your note without them even being there. It also assists you as a case manager when completing your other assessments because most of the questions have been answered during the note. It also helps you be consistent between your note and your assessment. Any action steps to be completed should also be included in your note. This will tell you what the next steps are for you as a case manager and the client. It also helps you develop the service plan. This part of your case note helps you determine when you can close and that all unmet needs have been addressed. You don't want cases lingering for months with no action plan, so this part is very important of your case note. Next slide, please. So in your case note, you want to get as much information as possible about the client and their situation. The best way to do that is to follow the where, who, why, what, how, and when approach. When you're talking about the where, you want to document where did it occur. This is talking about a specific interaction, where the encounter took place. For example, if it was a fall or or an eviction, you want to talk about that specific occurrence. The who is talking about who did it. Was it the client themselves or was another party involved? Who was involved? It is important to list everyone that was involved in the encounter. Who said it? You should document what all parties said during the visit/call. This piece of your case note is important because, again, like Tom said, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. What is the relationship? With each party that is involved in your case note, you should explain their relationship to the client or to the encounter. The why of the case note. This is talking about what is the reason for the action. If the case manager did not take the action, do not assume, always ask. The what part of the case note. What happened? What were the threats to personal health and safety or actions that got them to this point? The how addresses how did you do it? How did the client do it? How were they taking care of themselves before you even got involved? And lastly, the when did it happen? This is referring to a specific time. For example, did it happen when they were on their medications? What time of day did the incident occur? When did you find out? Explain any time lapses. Was there a significant amount of time between when the event occurred and when it was reported? And now I'm going to turn it back over to Tom.
All right. So the following guidelines will help ensure that documentation is appropriate and professional. It should be written in a factual, objective manner. Objective means that it can be measured, counted, seen by more than one person, and that two people reading the case note would have the exact same information. Okay, so the case manager saw X. The agency has suspended Mrs. Smith's service for 2 weeks because of X. Okay, the report from Dr. Jones dated August 13th stated blah. Mrs. Smith stated it was important for her to return home because X. Okay, so be factual, avoid objective language. Avoid subjective, judgmental, vague language. In other words, Babs talked earlier about avoiding labels. That includes things like Mrs. Smith is an alcoholic, Bob is schizophrenic, this client is incompetent, unless somebody has documented that in a diagnosis. So avoid vague things that if I were to read the note, I would have a different understanding of that word than Nikki would or Latoya would. Okay. And again, we talked about avoiding labels. The last one is refrain from using personal opinions or perceptions. Unless you're clearly label that, and it's okay to put a note, it is my opinion that this is an unsafe environment because of why. Okay, but if I'm going to use a personal opinion or perception, I have to clearly label it as such and explain the factual justification for that. Okay, avoid casual abbreviations. Avoid taking shortcuts. In other words, reread your note out loud and see would you understand it. Avoid generalizations or overinterpretation. Try to avoid grammatical errors. Avoid negative, biased, and prejudiced information. Avoid the use of medical diagnoses that have not been verified by a professional. Instead of saying the client is depressed, unless the client actually has a diagnosis or is taking medicine. Say, for example, the client states he's feeling sad today or is in a depressed mood.
So this is me. This is Latoya from CSRA. Consent. Case managers should obtain and document consent from all clients. Don't assume that because the client has some cognitive impairment, they aren't able to give consent. Be mindful that not all cognitive impairments are severe and clients can still give consent. They may be consent to participate or not participate in a program, or consent to allow another family member to speak on their behalf. This information should be documented. So values, preferences, and wishes, we've talked about those already. The client is the expert. They know what they need. They know what they value. So allow them to tell you that. Remember to be person-centered and allow the client to express to you what's important to him or her and what he or she wants to happen in her care. Case managers can suggest interventions, but keep in mind to suggest interventions that line up with the client's wishes, preferences, and values. And capacity, we've talked about that as well. Allow the client to tell you what their remaining strengths and sometimes what their remaining weaknesses are. That can help you in doing your case management or finding the services that they need. One of the things that I documented on this one was an example. Mrs. Smith said that she could actually do her housework, but doing your observation in the home, you observed that her floors were dirty. There were crumbs on the floor. There was a sink full of dishes. There was a counter full of dishes. So you want to put that in your case notes. You want to document what your observations were in the home. And we've talked a lot about dignity of risk as well. The client has the right to self-determination and the right to take reasonable risks. We don't always agree with the client's decision as case managers, but we must respect it. Ask the client if he or she understands the risk involved in this decision. Document the risk, document the client's understanding of the risk, and document his or her decision. Next slide. I think that's you, Nikki.
Sorry, I was muted. So consistency among case notes and assessments. It is important to be consistent between your case notes and your assessments. This will help you identify problems that you stated in your case note appear in your assessment. For example, if a client states that they are sad all the time or they're unhappy or miserable, then there should be a specialized depression screen assessment in the client's assessment tab in their file. Same thing with them being a fall risk, or if they say they fall a lot, there should be a steady fall risk assessment in the client's file as well. This information should be provided to the client so that they can address their falls or their depression at their next medical appointment. Remember, what you put in your case note should mirror what you put in your DONR food survey and your NSI. If you're saying the client is unable to complete the assessment by phone for cognitive reasons, it should be documented in the telephone section as such. Or if you documented that you observed the client's home and there was dishes overflowing on the counter and piles of trash on the floor, this should be reflected in the homemaker and meal preparation section of the DONR. Threats to personal health and safety. You should document if there are any threats that will cause the client to be placed in a facility or that represent immediate danger to the client. For example, if you have someone that falls frequently but too frail to pick themselves up, that should be documented that you address that issue. This also shows in your case note that you address the threat and the action that you are taking to prevent the threat to safety. It also helps you determine what resources or programs are available to the client based on their specific threat. Remember, even though you address the threat and provided resources, you still must respect the client's dignity or risk if they choose not to do anything, even if they choose not to do anything about it. If you document the threat and the action that you took, you are protected. Next slide.
So this is a case note. It says Mrs. Smith's family is dysfunctional. A case note should be written in a factual, objective manner. Objective language can be measured, counted, and seen by more than one person. Two people reading the same note should have the same understanding of the situation. So in order to correct this case note, you can state, case manager observed Mrs. Smith and her son yelling at one another. Mrs. Smith stated that her relationship with her son has been strained for years. So next slide. Okay, it's quick. Mrs. Smith was drunk. Instead of using that language, we want to say case manager observed Mrs. Smith having a staggered gait. When she opened the door, her speech was slurred and there was a strong smell of alcohol coming from her clothing. The next one, Mrs. Smith's son is an alcoholic. So we want to avoid labels such as alcoholic. Case managers can document the behaviors that they observe, the son displaying while at the home. For example, Mrs. Smith's son arrived at the home while completing the assessment. Case manager observed that he stumbled a few times upon entering the room. His speech was slurred and he had a strong smell of alcohol. Now, if Mrs. Smith states, you can document in quotation. I like to use quotations a lot. If the client states, my son is an alcoholic and he's not always dependable, you can put that in quotations because that's something that she said. Next slide.
So Mrs. Smith's house was messy. This statement is very subjective. You can tell that this is the opinion of the person completing the visit. This is something you should avoid when documenting. Since you are in the home as a case manager, you can reword this by documenting what you actually see or observe by saying this statement in your note. Case manager observed Mrs. Smith's home and noticed that the trash can was overflowing and the dishes were piled up on the counter. You should be very specific in your documentation and talk about factual events. You can even document how you addressed it or what action you took in reference to the trash and dishes overflowing. Next slide. Mrs. Smith was rude during my visit. Again, this statement is also subjective and it reflects your opinion. You want to avoid this in your documentation. You can reword this by saying, Ms. Smith continued to cut case manager short during the assessment and wouldn't allow her to move forward with questions. Again, be very specific with the action that took place. Next slide.